Whether or not you are a political junkie who was riveted to the federal TV debate yesterday, you most likely have an opinion about who should lead this country and how this country should be led. All the party candidates, with the exception of Green Party leader Elizabeth May, mixed it up yesterday in a feisty, sometimes dull, he said exchange. It is my pleasure to welcome political science professor Patrick Smith, who is currently the director of the Institute of Governance at SFU, to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Hi, Fanny.
Nice to see you. Good morning. Well, post-debate reflection. What did you think?
I thought the second half was better than the first half. I thought the format actually did allow for some, if there were interested Canadians who were trying to make up their minds, that there was some information that came out of some of those exchanges that were actually useful and that posed issues that gave people choices. Mm-hmm. So I thought that aspect of it was good. I think when one of the things that political junkies always look for in these things are the knockout punch, and everyone is prepped to avoid the knockout punch. So there
you noticed.
There wasn't any knockout punch. There were a few nice zingers and stabs, but I'd say there was nothing like even a technical knockout. Did
you have a favorite zinger or a stab?
Yes, there were a couple. The Jack Layton comment about the crooks in the Senate was a nice little one.
Right. Why do you need to build more jails? Because the crooks are having a pretty good time in the Senate. Yeah. Some crooks.
And even the way it was delivered as a kind of an aside was even better, because it just sort of interjected another note. But some of the exchanges were actually reasonably decent. I think Canadians would have benefited from being able to hear Elizabeth May in that. For beyond middle-aged males discussing the future of the country. When we talk, looking at polls, the gender gap for the government is a very significant one, and women are amongst the group in our society that are the least decided on their votes, that we would have benefited from another perspective, I think, certainly.
What in that debate do you think appealed to women specifically? Certainly there was a time when they talked a little bit about women who are assaulted. Abortion, the word only came up once. Yeah. Anything else you can think of, really women's specific? Not really.
Very, very little. A little bit on health, but mostly it was around the question of violence, and it was a kind of a late addition that that got added by, I think it was Jack Layton was the one who posted, and Ignatia picked it up.
And one of the messages that came through, one of the threads for me, was trust, contempt of Parliament, first Prime Minister ever to be in contempt of Parliament. Is that true, Professor?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And again, Ignatia, more than the others, said, you don't respect Parliament, you don't respect the rules, and Harper's reply was, you are political opportunists. We're having this election because you are political opportunists, not because I was in contempt or we were in contempt of Parliament.
Yeah, he dismisses the contempt of Parliament motion that was passed as a kind of a trivial item. I mean, it hasn't happened historically in the past. It's a bit like the Conservative Party's response on the question of election misspending on the in and out question, and to get a decision of the Federal Court of Appeal, basically saying that an element of the Conservative Party had broken the electoral law of Canada. To say it's an administrative matter is a rather tidy way to deal with some of your political and legal difficulties. So,
yes, it was rather tidy. Let's take a look. About 30 minutes in, Stephen Harper and Michael Ignatieff are debating what the spring election is really about.
Mr. Harper, we're having an election because you couldn't tell the truth to the Parliament of Canada about the money you're going to spend on jets, jails, and corporate tax giveaways. That's what this viewer can understand. We're in the middle of the biggest deficit in Canadian history. You didn't tell the truth to the Canadian Parliament. You're the first Prime Minister found in contempt of the Canadian Parliament. And right now you're trying to persuade Canadians you're not cutting corporate tax.
Well,
you cut it from,
first of all,
you've cut it down to 15, it'll go from 16.5 to, and nobody can understand why that makes sense when we're in the middle of the toughest deficit we've seen because of your waste and mismanagement.
Mr. Harper. Mr. Ignatieff, let's be clear. The contempt motion that you guys pushed was a motion you three voted against us. You had more votes than we do. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's based on any realistic facts, but you were determined to have an election, whether the public wanted an election or not. What we view Canadians should be focused on is the economy. We're keeping taxes down to create jobs. That is working.
The first question out of the gate to the debaters was why corporate tax cuts? Why $6 billion?
Well, Mr. Harper's line is very simple, which was that these were things that are already previously agreed. So there's nothing in his current budget. That this is past budgets that we're dealing with. It ignores the question again, and Mr. Harper had some success in trying to avoid some of the questions, but that was how he sought to avoid that one, certainly. The other point in the clip I think is interesting is that Mr. Harper has made some political hay out of the idea that it's the opposition parties that forced this election. I think any good read of the situation is that Mr. Harper wanted this election as much as anybody else, and he crafted a budget that would not appeal to enough opposition parties to gain support so it could pass in the House. So because I think the polls were showing him at that point, and the Conservatives at close to 40%, which is where things start to break toward majority government. So I think it was in his interest as much as anybody else's. So I'm not sure he's being entirely truthful when he says it was all their fault for having the election. I think they all share some blame.
And as you know, a simple statement is often fraught with complexity. When you talk about jets, that's a whole discussion in its own place, really. What would they cost? What hasn't been done? What is the truth? Do we need jets? If we do need jets, when will we actually pay for the jets?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think the opposition parties, particularly Liberals, have picked up the jets, jails, and corporate tax cuts as a kind of jingle, which has had some legs. I think Canadians understand that in the context of worrying about jobs and healthcare issues, to think, okay, well, we're getting these jets. You know, what are we going to do with these jets?
Right, but the question is, are we getting them at the right price? Really?
Well, we don't know the price.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
And Ignatieff pointed out again about the justice system. Let's not go the way of the United States of America. We don't need to build mega jails. But we do need to get tough on crime.
Sure, but there's different ways to get tough on crime. I mean, one of the ways to get tough on crime, and I think most of the other opposition leaders all picked up on that theme, which is that the evidence from criminologists is that the American model doesn't produce less crime. So you can get tough on crime, but that includes a whole series of things from education through crime prevention programs that are part of getting tough on crime. And there are people in our society that misbehave in such inappropriate ways that they need to be removed from the society. But to say that anyone should be thrown away and not have options to be rehabilitated is a kind of a non-starter.
Oh, the long gun registry. Well, when voters go into the booth, or when they cast their ballot online, I assume we can. Not sure how that's going to work. Will the long gun registry be on a citizen's mind? Do you think, whether to scrap it or keep it?
It'll be on the mind of rural Canadians, but if you look at the political map of Canada, most of rural Canada is currently voting Conservative. So it'll only become a factor then if Mr. Harper gets a majority and goes ahead with his majority. Most urban Canadians, irrespective of whether they're Liberal, New Democrat, Greens, or whatever, or Bloc Québécois, are all in favor of a gun registry that includes long guns. And so I don't think it's much of an issue in urban Canada at all. And now most Canadians live in urban settings, so there is a nice divide there. But I'm not sure that the long gun registry is likely to be something that's going to turn this election around.
I was wondering if you were just an ordinary Canadian sitting in your living room and you're listening to this debate about trust and democracy and contempt of Parliament, what you would be thinking. Would you be thinking, gee, you know, I don't have a GP? Or, you know, will I have a pension when I retire? And why are they not talking about that more specifically?
Oh, I think so. I mean, in the first days of when the election was being called and the contempt of Parliament issue was being raised, there was a debate around what the narrative of the election would be. And my sense at the very beginning was it was posed around trust on the one side and contempt, and managers of the economy on the other side. And just thinking about it myself, I thought, I bet 2 weeks down into this election where we are now, it's going to be whether you can trust them on the economy, which is they've come together. And I think that's probably a good thing for getting closer to the kinds of concerns that you're suggesting that ordinary Canadians have about very specific aspects of the economy. Not what's happening with the G8 and the G20, but do I have a job?
But the G8 and the G20 right out of the gate, and as you know, that's a bit of a bird's nest. Sheila Fraser has, a report has been leaked. Do you know the details on this? A report has been leaked about the spending at G8, G20. They had $80 million, they spent $50 million in Huntsville for the G8, G20, or did they, or do we know?
We don't know entirely, because what we have are parts of leaked versions of a document, and any government goes through some iterations of producing official reports, and certainly someone as careful as Ms. Fraser would go through some document stages to get there. So what we see is versions of this, and they'll get edited at various points, but I think the inherent truth, if it looks like the first two drafts suggest that there was spending that was probably not appropriate and was not transparent and was not accounted for, in the sense that this fund was for border security. I don't think building gazebos for Tony Clement in Huntsville
or lakes, fake lakes.
The fake lake.
No, it's true.
I don't think we would feel a lot more secure unless we have those the new fighters to defend the fake lake.
Well, exactly, because as you know, if you are granted money to use it in a certain spot when you're in government, you have to use it in a certain spot.
Yeah.
You can't scatter it or waste it or do any of the above. We still don't know. Will we see that paper released before the election?
We might, but it's going to be an extraordinary circumstance if we do, because the Auditor General is an officer of Parliament, and her task is to report to Parliament, and Parliament's not sitting, so we have to get a Parliament for her to. So under normal circumstances and the current law, that's what would have to happen. With the agreement of all the party leaders, and perhaps involving the Speaker of the House and her accommodation, given the circumstances, because she's now been thrown into an election which wasn't her intention at all, it seems to me not impossible that we might actually get that release, but it's going to take it will establish a new precedent for Parliament.
But it goes back to the point, you cannot mislead the House of Commons. That's a no-no.
Absolutely.
For the House of Commons to do business, you have to tell them the truth. Nothing but the truth.
Sure. And I think the first version talked about misleading the House. The second version doesn't quite use the term misleading, but you're left with the same impression. Any reading of it is you've spent money that you didn't have authority to spend in a place you didn't, that wasn't approved to spend.
Well, it was 3 against the Prime Minister for sure.
Oh,
There's
sure.
no question about that. But he stayed on message, online, spoke directly to the camera, didn't really speak to the others, just talked to the camera.
Oh yeah, no. His job was to be. Someone described him as George Savallo. You have to make it to the 12th round and, without getting knocked down. And I mean, he had some points of difficulty, I suppose, where people did score points against him, but he certainly wasn't knocked down. He performed. He did what he needed to do yesterday.
Sure. Professor Patrick Smith, our guest, a political scientist. We'll come back.